So, Hot Wobble here. Today I'm going to be teaching you how to make a beat like the one on Nobody Speak by DJ Shadow. And we're going to go through the whole process, right from choosing sounds, analyzing that reference track, all the way through how to mix it together, right? And some things that you could probably implement on your own mixes. So, strap in. We got a lot to talk about, right? First of all, I can't play the original Nobody Speak track, which sucks, because YouTube is crazy about copyrights, but it's just the state of the times where we're at. So I'm trying to play by the rules here. I'm assuming because you clicked on this video, you're familiar with the track, right? So check it out, get it fresh in your ears, pull up a YouTube video or your Spotify or whatever, and when you listen to it, or any reference track, there's a couple things that I would advise that you talk about, or that you listen for and think about, right? First of all, the genre, because that's going to determine a lot of the tempo decisions you make. Like in the case, if you're writing hip hop, like tempo is kind of decided for you. So in this case, I'm writing at 85 BPM, right? You also want to think about the sonic palette, like what kinds of sounds are they choosing? How are they mixed? What's the overall sonic vibe of this recording? And you want to think about like the form of it, and like in terms of how that divides up. Like how long is the intro? What about the next part? How long are the hooks? Like all that kind of stuff. You want to think about just how the thing is divided up. Then vocals, are there any? Are there not any? And then finally, you want to think in terms of, you have your reference, but where are you gonna put your track? Like, is it the kind of thing where you're trying to produce something from start to finish, release it? Are you trying to sell the beat to somebody? In my case, I'll tell you exactly what was going on. Somebody hit me up and was looking for video, or looking for music to sync to video. They sent me Nobody Speak as a reference. They said, "You got anything like this?" I'm looking, right? And I'm thinking, I definitely got something, but I just had to tweak it a little bit to make sure that it made sense for that context. Like in that context, they were looking for probably like 30-second to a minute long chunk of music, so I wanted to just give a couple options, not just have one static beat. So I actually ended up, adding a couple things. But anyway, so you want to consider those 5 things roughly when you listen to references. That's what I was listening for. In my case, as far as this beat goes, the things that I think jump out, right? Like down-tempo hip-hop. The form is kind of blocky. It's like 4 bars and then 8, then 16, then, so it's very, logical kind of form. Sonically, it's like very old school vibes, right? There's a lot of very vintage, like 60s, 70s sounding guitars and basses. Obviously there's a vocal. For my purposes, I didn't need one, so I didn't choose to put one on there. We're just talking about the beat today. But one of the things that jumped out a lot to me was there's a horn sample, or maybe they brought in session players, whatever. But there was like a real stabby, like bop bop, right, like kind of syncopated horn sample with a lot of like really crunchy mid range on it. So I said, you know what? That's a lot of the vibe. I think that's what's gonna help make this track that I'm gonna write sound like the original. So I'm not gonna play you the original one. You got to do that on your own watch. But I will play you what I made. Right? This was the original thing I had. So real funky horns, right, with the old school bass kind of sound, and I added a Fender Rhodes. I don't think there is one on the original track. I think it's more guitar, but I was trying to get in that vintage sonic palette, right? So that's what I made, and then originally that's what I started with. And then when I was talking to the guy, I was like, let me give him some other things. So I added this, just intro, drums, and bass, so he can edit to that. Now we're gonna hear a Rhodes hit. Alright, I'll play the last part. Let's just skip to that. So after the horn thing. Real chilled out. Why's my master so low? Turn this up. Right? So different kind of vibe on the back end. So now the editor has a couple options. So the first thing I started with, and that I would recommend you start with, you're gonna need some kind of, like, just like I described it, like syncopated, very punchy horn part. And in general, for a lot of these parts, I think part of what makes this vibe and the beats like swing so hard is the way it lands on 2 and 4, right? That was something I was hearing a lot of, like, right? 2 and 4 is always real big and fat, right? So I wanted to put a lot of elements in that landed on that. This is a flattened version of some chops I made. So to get to this, and maybe when you're looking for your own kind of samples to use, I would recommend just grabbing a bunch of samples, because I didn't really know what I was looking for, right? So I'm a big fan of Splice. It's just a searchable, royalty-free sample website. So you can use all this stuff in productions and sell it, and it's like not a problem. Nobody's gonna come after you. Beautiful. Still an underrated resource, but so I hopped on Splice when I originally made this, and then I also got back on there for some of this drum stuff. But I put together, in addition to my reference, a sample bank. So I just grabbed a bunch of samples. Oh, let me solo this. So I just grabbed a lot of horn samples. Most of these I didn't use, but I needed to hear a bunch of them next to each other to figure out what I wanted. That's a good one. Yeah, like there's a lot of good ones that I may very well use these in a beat where I'm just writing and trying to see what comes out, and I'm not really sure what I'm making. But in this case, since I was trying to nail a vibe for a reference track that somebody was like, hey, can you get something similar to this? I needed to just lay some shit out to have something, you know, to compare to. This sample, I think this was the one. Yep. This was the sample I settled on. Let me see. I believe that's part of my cut together version. Let me just grab the original, which should still be in my split. Yeah, this is the original sample. So let's just listen to this. So some good things. I liked how it was leaning on 2 and 4, kind of. But there was like also this awkward space in the middle that didn't really feel like conducive to the loop that I wanted. That was a little bit more of a constant presence. So I'll show you what I did over here. I'll compare it to this, to my chop, right? This is a pretty simple chop to do, right? So I just took the first part of it, right? Let me just solo this. Go in here. Okay, yeah, set that to 1. Okay, let me just adjust this. Cool. So now, the first thing that I did, this was almost in my tempo, right? But I just took these horn hits right here. Pow! That stuff. I wanted to make sure that landed pretty squarely on 2 and 4, right? And then, as you can see, like, this is the same, this is the same. This stuff, I just moved back to make this a little funkier when it lands on 4. Like, listen, here it is without. It's a little straight. Sorry, my phone is going off. Let me just mute that. I think usually when I'm warping stuff, I just tend to massage things a little bit until I feel like it's sitting right. Something about having those Barry sax pickups on like the 16th notes and then land on 4 just felt like it made more sense, right? So then what I did, as I took this, just duplicated it, right? Right? There's that, and then I did that once more, except I took this longer hit, and I cut this in just to help make it a longer phrase. I like having longer phrases in general, like instead of just like like a 1-bar thing that loops over and over again. If you cut this in, now you're gonna have a 4-bar phrase, right? Which is a little more interesting to listen to. So again, this one we're gonna have to turn warp on, and again, so I took this, trying to make that horn hit land on 4. All right, same thing here. I just slid this around until it. I wanted that big slidey trumpet thing to be off the beat too. That seemed like it made more sense. So anyway, you put that together. Now you have your horn loop. Alright, so all I did, that's the whole loop. Then I just took this, you highlight, hit Apple J, it'll consolidate, right? I don't need to do it again, but that's how I got to this loop, is just through cutting together a horn sample. And that I decided was going to be kind of the centerpiece of this beat, right? Just taking inspiration from the original DJ Shadow, right? So that's that. So look for a funky horn beat, something that's landing on 2 and 4, and if it's not quite there, you're going to massage it a little bit with the warp markers, right? The next thing I came to, as I was looking for, like, you know, kind of sampled sounding vintagey drums. So this was the first part that I added, right? This beat didn't come like this, but the process I used to get this to sit in time with my track, with my metronome and all that, is exactly the same process as what I just showed you here, right? I made sure that the snares are lining up on 2 and 4, right? And then I moved the kicks around a little bit just to get the right kind of like flop onto the beat. I don't know why I said flop, but whatever. It had that feeling of like, it's just like slump onto the beat that gives it this laid back feeling. So I was just sliding things around until that felt right. And I cut together a couple things here, right? So the next element, now that we have this kick and snare thing, in the original reference I was hearing some hi-hat and maybe even shakers, so I actually did the same thing with another drum loop that has some hats in it, except I filtered out most of the lows because I didn't want the kick drums to be fighting each other. I was just looking for that top end. So super simple, just filter out the lows, little mid-range boost to give it some crunch, and then put that together. That brings us to this. Already starting to feel like something. Here it is with the horns. Alright, the only thing that I was kind of missing is the snare in this middle loop. The snare had a nice crack to it, a nice smack, which is cool, but I was missing some of the punch that comes in the bottom, like 200 hertz, 300 hertz, that range of, right? It needed a little bump to it. So I just went in my sample library and got this snare. There's no EQ. There's nothing on this. That's it, right? It just had the right feeling, and I layered it in just so it supported the crack of that top end snare a little bit better. So all together, I'll take some of my effects off so you can hear what this was like before it got mixed together. Well, actually, let me get my bus effects off too. I will go through all these, so just hang on tight, right? Let me turn this master up. So that's what I was starting with. Drum-wise. Here's the horns. Alright, so I definitely had a vibe. Let me put these effects back so you can get the full experience. Alright, cool. So now, at that point, it was starting to really feel like, you know, we're headed in the right direction. The next thing I did, I just laid down a bass line myself. Again, in a second, when we get to the mixing part, we'll go through, you know, why all these effects are in place and that kind of thing. The bass I used was this thing. This is a Squire vintage modified PJ bass that I got for $180 on Reverb.com. The thing is friggin' awesome considering how much I paid for it. It's got half-round strings on it, which is a pretty flexible string I find, especially on this style of bass. You know, if you're not a bass player, you're gonna have to find samples or get somebody to come in. You know, that's something I can just do. Fortunately, like I went to music school. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in the bass. So if I couldn't put down a bass line, something went horribly wrong. But this is what I was using to get the sound. And then as far as tracking it, I have a metric halo interface, a metric halo 2882. And I was just taking it in through this channel with like the FET character, which had some good things. It was maybe a little too heavy in the low mids and I had to compensate, but generally this does a pretty good job. I like this interface a lot, and some of these analog models are really nice. So that just came in direct to the computer through the interface, right? So anyway, at this point I laid down a bass line. Sample-wise, for a little bit more vibe, on the original track there's like some guitars and it's like some effects and glitchy stuff, but very tastefully done. So to get some of that element, I got some Fender Rhodes, one of my favorite sounds ever. These EQs are both for mixing purposes more. This Fab filter, it was a little muddy, a little too dark, so I'm just pulling some low mids out and then boosting on top just to give it a little bit more sparkle. This is kind of doing the same thing actually. This Mag Audio is great for boosting highs. So yeah, these are both just to get a little bit more clarity out of that Rhodes sound. But then this Echo plugin, which I think the Ableton Echo is one of the best plugins they've ever made. This is all just to put vibe on it, right? Real quick, checking out the settings. Quarter note delay, 50% feedback. The filter is set to ditch all the lows. We're dealing mostly highs and mids. And then character in this settings, I am hot wobble. I have to use the wobble setting, right? No, but this is great. This puts just kind of like a little bit of a warble on all the repeats. Set this guy to ping pong mode, 34% wet dry, and you're there. This is without. Oh, I have a little reverb on this too. I'll get to the reverb in a second. Here's the effect totally dry. So it works, but I think adding this echo, especially with that wobble setting, so it twists a little bit, it just helps propel the whole thing and have a little bit more motion for the drums to sit on top of, right? Here, this I did something kind of interesting. I used different Rhodes samples, right? Also into that delay plugin. But here, I took this Rhodes hit, right? Transposed it up. Now that's back to the original pitch. Transpose it down. Then back to the original. Just to give a little bit more motion before we drop into the main section here, which is this guy with my horns, right? So anyway, that's there's one more part, right? Another keyboard part. Solo that so you can hear. This I didn't need to do much to. It is hitting my bus reverb, which we're gonna go over. But I'm also having this Fab filter reverb on the track itself. Just because I wanted a lot of space for everything else to sit on top of. So this is almost, between the two reverbs, almost like an ambient kind of sound, but there's still a little motion in it. So this is how it sits. Just to have something different for the rhythm parts to cruise on top of. So anyway, that was all the, compositionally, that's kind of why I made these decisions and what in the original track was kind of inspiring me. I know but one constant theme throughout, whether it's in this Rhodes sample, is I'm trying to emphasize that swing that leads you to 2 and 4. So In this case, I'm leaving some space on 2 and then filling in on 4 just to have a little bit of back and forth, right? To help. And you know what? Playing bass lines, I messed around with it until I found a couple ideas that I felt worked with the drums and the horn sample, because that's what I was building the whole thing around, right? So anyway, that's kind of the end to part 1 of this, right? When we talk about the compositional aspects and why these things are the way they are. Let's talk about mixing now, right? Because that's a whole other beast, right? So let's go through it again, but talk mix, right? Here on this horn sample, you can even see it. There's a baritone hit that's a lot quieter than the higher horns. This is really, that was like really kicking my butt, right? So what I did is I automated the baritone to be higher, and then the higher horn hit to be a little bit lower, just to help make this more of an even presence, right? So I just had to go in and do that. All right, whatever. Then to also help even it out, I put this EQ on, right? These 2 EQ points, 2 and 5, are to help. I just scanned around until I found a spot where I was getting kind of the maximum growl from that baritone saxophone. Just because it was quieter, I was trying to bring it out. And then I cut some of the highs because that's where those other horns are dominating. So in addition to automating this EQ, or automating the volume, I'm doing some EQ stuff to help smooth this out. And then finally, I have a compressor. And I have the threshold set, so it's only touching that baritone a little bit, and the higher horns are getting smacked pretty hard. Well, it's not getting hit that hard, but it's like right on that line where the baritone is getting through and the higher horns are getting compressed. And I am compressing with a higher ratio. I'm using 8. Pretty quick attack, 1 millisecond. And then I just set the release to make sure that it recovers in time for the next hit. That's the logic there, right? Again, my snare, this snare I pasted in, I'm doing nothing. There's something innately satisfying about having a sound that just works in a mix without you having to really mix it that much. It just sits and it's perfect and, oh, thank you God, right? So that's always cool. On the drums, kind of the core drum track, I'm using the Vertigo VSM3. This is a distortion plugin. On drums, I almost always use some kind of distortion just to help the transients pop through and have a lot of character and smack, right? If you've never used this, I'm doing something kind of sneaky. So this section and this section are 2 different distortion modes, right? I'm using them both. This knob, the THD mixer, mixes between the 2 modes, right? On this side, I have some drive and kind of my wet dry here set at 68%. I'm distorting the lows, right? And only in the middle field. So in other words, the field that's common between your 2 speakers, not the sides. Here I'm doing the opposite. Similar settings, I have drive and a wet dry mix happening, except I'm distorting the high mids and only in the side field. So only the things that are opposite, right? And this technique of treating the mid and side a little differently, as well as distorting the drums, it's not even distortion, I call it saturation, right? We're adding harmonics. This makes them really snap, right? And I'm also just using a utility plugin to narrow them. They were a little too, it was too uneven side to side, so I just had to center them a little bit. But here it is without this distortion thing. Now here it is with. The drums, to me, when you hit some kind of distortion, you don't have to use this one. I just really like it. There's many good distortion plugins for this purpose. But yeah, it just has this effect of like taking the drums from being like here to like here. They're just like much more forward. So that's a technique I use pretty much all the time. Again, we talked about this. I'm just taking lows out of this top layer. My snare layer, I'm doing nothing. I have all 3 of these bussed to a drum group, right? And then from here, let's just play these. I'm using the Ableton drum bus, which I think is another, like, the Echo is like their greatest plugin ever made, but the drum bus is their other greatest plugin ever made. The Ableton did such a good job with this. Basically, what's happening, I'm trimming off a little bit of volume. I'm adding in more crunch on the whole thing, not just this. Now, so I guess you could say I am putting an effect on the snare, if you really want to be honest, because it's hitting this, right? But whatever. So I'm getting some top-end distortion. That's what this crunch control does. No dampening. This is all the way open. This has a pretty good transient control built into it, just to put some more sauce and, again, help those drums pop through to the front of the mix, so they really sound forward. So I use this a lot of the time, and then this boom control is synthesizing more lows to help support the kick. Without this, it was a little thin. That's my kick without. Much more, just so much more low-end presence when you do that. And I tuned it such that we're using 17%, so not really heavy, but enough to fill it in. And I'm making sure that it's synthesizing at a frequency in the key of the song. In this case, everything is kind of revolving around an A minor sort of feeling. So I put this on an A-ish, and made sure to keep it low enough that it was out of the way of my bass. Very important, because you don't want your bass and your kicks or any other element fighting for that low-end space. It has to be very clear in a mix what's sitting in the low end and what's kind of out of the way, right? So we'll get into more of that in a sec. So anyway, that's my drums, right? That's how it's functioning with the horns. Let's talk about the bass, because I'm doing a bunch of stuff, right? Some of which might not seem super intuitive. So this is the bass without anything on it. Good starting sound, I'd say. Little too fuzzy in the low mids is what I was hearing, and not consistent enough. Some notes were sounding louder than others, right? Very common, so I'm using a very standard chain on this bass. So first, we're EQing with the UAD Neve 1081 plugin. So what I'm doing is I am filtering out the lowest of lows, right? So below 92. Which keeps my bass out of the way of the kick and those synthesized frequencies I was just adding in, right? And I'm also filtering off some top above 9.2. There's really no useful information above that frequency for a bass, right? So I was like, let's just tighten this up, get rid of any high-end noise. Most of that is going to be like string noise, which you don't want, right? Then from there, I have a little bit of a bump around 100-ish, right, which is a little bit above my lows in the drums. So now we have, space defined for everything. And then I'm taking out a lot of those low mids. Like this is set around 220, but I played around in this whole range, 330, 270. That's just where it settled. So that's just where it sat the best, I thought. EQ-wise. And then the other reason for picking this EQ is Neve EQs just have a ton of vibe on them. They have, when I say vibe, I mean they impart a certain character that's very musical, right? So that was the reason for choosing this EQ over others, right? Then I'm going into the UAD 1176 compressor. And I'm, again, not very controversial settings. Ratio of 4, kind of a speedy but not as fast as it will go attack, and a quick enough release that it recovers in time for the next note. And I'm really just setting this up so it's catching the notes that are popping out, right? So I can just bring up the quieter stuff and make my bass a more even kind of presence. I also wasn't trying to make the bass as forward as it can possibly go. It's just I'm trying to support what's happening, right, and add some counterpoint through the bass line I'm playing. Now I have a gate just to tighten up the back. There was some little noises behind notes that I wasn't really liking. So it's cutting out like some little, there's like a couple ghost notes that are getting cut out, I guess, as well as like the ends of things got tightened up. So I I'll often use gates just to tighten up the back end of things. And then finally, even though I liked the vibe of this that the UAD stuff was putting on, I guess you could tighten this up just with one EQ. This isn't the most elegant way to do it, but I will often use some kind of analog EQ up front for vibe and get the basic shape. And then I'll put a digital one that's a lot more transparent behind it, just to dial it in. So it looks like this is doing conflicting things, and it is a little bit, but I just was using this to get the final setting of the bass frequency without messing up the vibe that this was putting on that I liked a lot. Most of the cutting I'm doing here is low, and I'm trying to just make sure that the bass is out of the way of the kick. That's really the main goal here. Oh, yikes. Let me just flip this back. Oop, I made a mistake. Alright, put this back here. Okay. It's about like that. Fine. Or I guess I should probably just use the undo button, huh? Yeah, there we go. Okay, now it's exactly where it was. Fine. I'm being impulsive over here. So anyway, that's the bass. That was the logic there. We talked about the Rhodes. We talked about this. Let's talk about the master chain now, right? So let's go to our master, right? I trimmed a little bit. It was coming in pretty hot into the master, so I didn't want to overload this. Just did a little gain staging. I have another video about that if you don't know what gain staging is. But yeah, that just a little input trim. I pretty much always use a bus compressor to help glue the whole mix together. This is, you know, arguably the bus compressor that everybody uses. It'd be great. Maybe one day I'll have a real one. I would love to. But for now, like this Waves one is really good. So I usually leave the analog mode on because I like the character that imparts. It adds some overtones and some non-linearities that are nice. Because I'm using mostly samples. Oh, wait, I forgot to talk about something. My bad. We're not going to do master yet. I want to go back to here, to my drums, right? I think I skipped these, right? I talked about drum bus. Sorry, I was just thinking about samples, right? To glue together all these sampled drums, I'm lightly compressing with the API 2500 plugin. I'm going to talk about gluing the whole mix in a second, but let's just talk about this. I'm using all samples that are already fairly compressed, right? So, if I was using acoustic sources that were not already treated, I would probably set this up a little heavier. But for now, how I'm setting it up is a light ratio, just a ratio of 2 to help glue my drums together, right? I gotta talk about this and another thing, actually. Attack-wise, fairly quick, not as fast as it will go. Because, again, I don't want to crush the transients at the front of stuff that give a lot of the punch of the drum, right? So we're using that, you know, just release time to make sure that we're recovering quickly enough for the next hit. Medium knee, I like the thrust mode on this is cool. If you use the loud mode, it lets a little bit more of the lows through before the compressor clamps down. So it's not, like if you leave this on normal, it's a totally flat response. But sometimes the lows get too pumpy. So I like the medium or loud setting, lets a little more of that through, so you're mostly compressing the top together. And then as far as like the compression algorithm inside, I always check both. I tend to favor the feedback mode versus feed forward, but kind of depends on what I'm doing. And I'm not linking the compressor at all, right? So anyway, that's that. The other piece of sauce I'm putting in here, I have a this UAD EMT 140 reverb plugin. It's a plate reverb thing, very well known, very awesome. I'm sending a bunch of things to this. Here it is without, just so you can hear. So it sounds good, but to my ear, some of these elements still sounded like they were too separated. So in the effort to glue them together, I'm sending a couple things to reverb. Just if you want to hear the reverb, it's mostly horns and drums, right? I'm just sending. Horns are mostly what I'm sending here, but I'm also throwing some drums in there, just to add a little bit more wash to help fill in some spaces. Which brings me now to my master, right? Because now when I put this master bus comp on, it gives it a little more to chew on, I guess. I guess that's how I would describe it. So because there's reverb filling in some space, when the master bus starts to clamp down on it, it's going to feel more like one unit, right? So anyway, getting back to what I was saying as far as what this plugin does, the analog modeling circuit here is going to also help contribute to that effect by adding some nonlinear, very subtle kinds of distortions. And we don't hear it as like distortion, we hear it as like kind of a fatness or a meat. So this plugin is awesome for that. Setting wise, because I'm using mostly samples, I'm a little light on the ratio, right? I almost will never use 10 unless I'm using this on drums or something that warrants that really heavy ratio. For a master bus, I use usually a ratio of 4 a lot, sometimes 2 if that's too much. In this case, 4 was cool. Pretty quick attack, because now we're going to start to really crunch things together to get the level up to where we want it to be. And I set the threshold so we have at the most about 4 dB of gain reduction, right? This could maybe even go a touch light, heavier, right? Here it is. Let me play it without all this stuff so you can hear. Just A/B. We're going to talk about mixing. Now here it is with. So if I adjust for the difference in gain, right? To me, this adds a lot of thickness and a lot of. Everyone says glue, but it's really true. It just makes all these separate elements sound more like one unit that's kind of working together, right? So I pretty much always will use some kind of bus compression. This SSL one is really good, but there's many others that we could lean on, or like even this this API one that I'm using on the drums, the 2500. This makes a nice bus compressor too. I'll often A/B a couple to see, what's fitting the vibe. Let's talk about this. This is more distortion, right? More subtle saturation. This black box analog design plugin, I really like. It adds a lot of just thickness, and helps transients and those kinds of percussive elements really pop, right? So this is pretty conservative settings. Flat saturation. I'm boosting the grit a little bit here. Slight boost in this pentode setting. Slight boost in the triode. The air amount is really nice. Just puts a sheen over the top of things that's very musical. So anyway, light distortion. This kind of thing was a mixing trick that I just didn't know about for a long time. I couldn't figure out why like professional masters or like radio stuff sounded so much more exciting from a sonic standpoint. And a lot in my case, a lot of like the missing sauce was some kind of saturation to help it just pop, right? And as you can see, I'm doing this on several levels to several of the elements. Everything from individual drums all the way to the full mix, right? So yeah, and this, like I said, I'm just adding some saturation and trimming the output a little bit, right? Finally, because this is something I was sending to a music supervisor to be potentially used in something, I couldn't really go through the normal process of like, let me do my mix, and then let me wait a day to let my ears clear, and then I'll do the master, right? This is something, it was on my computer, he needed it like now, so I was like, let's just get this out. For doing like a quick and dirty master and getting things up to a competitive kind of level where it can sit with something, this is part of what I use, right? Brainworks Master Desk. I like this plugin because it has a lot of tools that I would normally reach for in one place, right? So it's got a couple different compressor compressor modes, right? I'm again compressing further. Sometimes in mixes I'll hit one bus compressor really hard. The other approach, which is what I'm using here, is I hit a bunch of compressors and they're all doing a little bit, right? I use both in context, but in this case, this is just what it ended up being, right? So here we have these resonance filters that are just. I'll normally check these to see if there is like some annoying resonance that I can pull out. Also, I'll sometimes do this with EQ. As you can hear, in this case, I was hearing some resonance both at 160 and like kind of my lowest of low mids, as well as here. Here is a worse one, I think. 3150. It's just kind of ringing. It's not really contributing to the musicality of anything. Sometimes I'll use these. Sometimes I'll just notch out stuff with EQ. They have a little tone control, so I'm boosting bass a little bit. Some more parallel compression happening here. I turned off the harmonic distortion completely because I'm adding a ton of it with this thing. So that wasn't really necessary. This foundation control is more, it helps you set where your bass is, right? So again, using a little bit of this, and I'm widening the stereo field of the whole thing a little bit, just to make it pop, right? So that's this. This is kind of like a quick and dirty mastering plugin. I haven't used it on a real mastering session. I could totally see myself doing it. But anyway, that's just to get this thing ready to kind of just get out, right? And now to get up to the final level, I'm using this UAD limiter, which I find to be pretty good. And then to check the volume, right? Or check the loudness level. This is an AB plugin that I normally would use to check between a lot of different references, but I'm using it to monitor the dynamics because I think it's really good for it. Let me just play this here. So this gives you a nice readout of like the dynamics over time, right? And then over here we have a loofs meter, which is great. This is actually maybe a little louder than I would want it to be, right? I might even pull this back a little bit. Maybe go back to something like here. The reason why is typically I'm looking for something that has to sit with like a commercial release. For this kind of purpose, like a sync opportunity, I'm looking for an integrated overall loofs level of roughly between 10 to 8 loofs, right? We're running a little hot now, but the intro is quieter, right? So let's just zero this out. Oh no, I want to go back a little bit more. Yeah, here we go. Alright, so this is, like I said, this part, it's around 10, kind of on the lower side of things. My integrated loops, and then here, this is louder, right? So you see the short-term numbers all jump up. But I'm looking for an integrated, kind of over the whole track level of ideally like 8.5 or 9, something in that range. And I'm hitting it pretty on the nose right now. You can see the short term, like this section is louder, but the outer moments are definitely quieter, right? So that's kind of the numbers that I'm shooting for like one of these quick and dirty sort of masters. I'll be a little bit more picky if I'm doing a master for somebody else. Like I would typically reference a bunch of tracks in the genre and see kind of what the median is, and that's where I would get my numbers from. But here, I'm just referencing the one track that they want that they need something that it resembles that, right? So I'm only really using the one reference track in that case. So my quote-unquote, this is like pseudo-mastering, but this process is a little different than if I was doing something for like an artist, right? So anyway, that's the logic there behind the master chain, the mix, the composition, everything. If I left anything out, or if I like jumped from something else to whatever, and you were like, hey, how did you do this or whatever, please just leave me a question in the comments. I'd be happy to make another video to answer your question. In the meantime, like, subscribe, like I said, leave comments. If you want to hit me on social media, I will put up my Twitter and my Instagram on the screen, so you can check that out. Follow me there. But yeah, thanks for checking this out. If you want me to do more of these, I'll take a couple requests too. Send me some tracks you want to see me split apart and do a reference to. So anyway, happy music making to you. Until the next one, this is Hot Wobble.